GM, GN, GA, all the G's to all the G's. This is We the Film 3 Thursdays. Today we're mapping the filmmaking landscape. It's the idea of this is to try and give everyone a pathway. It's just how we kind of see it, how I've been through it kind of traditionally, and how I'm seeing it work now with what I see people getting jobs doing and such like that, and just how to fulfill all that in the traditional sense, in the newer sense, and just kind of like how to build on that in various ways, because there's a bunch of different ways to kind of get into this. In it's an aspect of do you get into whatever part of this industry you fit best with, because it really is kind of this very custom thing. It's kind of, and the early notes we had on this, I'm glad we kept it, is about like the hero's journey, and every one of these creative endeavors is a hero's journey. And if you've ever been on a creative endeavor, like you make an album together, you make a song together, you write something together, you do something as a group in any which fashion, either remotely or in person, like getting to that end of that story very much feels like when you finish that project, you celebrate its finish and you keep moving on. It's really like a very heroic type of feeling. So a lot of this is going to almost follow through with that. Is like these are the kind of steps towards these, the end of your hero's journey or whatever into your next journey. Because all this is like all creative journeys should be like kind of treated that way. Because it's a great feeling to get at the end of it. But that's kind of the practical of all of it. We're going to get a little bit more deeper in. Michael, do you have anything you wanted to add to that intro?
But when I pitched the idea to Heidi towards the end of 2024, I was like, we could do the writing, we could do the hero's journey and mix it up with like the turn from being a writer to becoming an author. And it wasn't until about halfway through that I was like, I wonder if anybody's done this before. And, they had. So perhaps you would want to go look that up for a more concise or focused kind of program for that. But the thing here to contextualize it, I think, in addition to what Chris said, being about creativity and being able to kind of transmute ideas into different formats. Not only is the program doing that, but I think a lot of us here do that in the scene, whether that's AI or filmmaking or creativity, whatever it might be, writing, filmmaking, music, cooking, it could be anything. So yeah, I think that just being able to have these frameworks that are, you're able to kind of really flexibly manipulate and adjust into new contexts for you to be able to exercise your ideas is important. And here we are in the film 3 space, filmmaker space. If you're doing it as an indie, you have to really be flexible. And I don't want to use the cliche, but I'm going to. We wear a lot of hats. You're going to end up doing a bunch of different stuff. So this program today, I think, is the most thorough and broad overview that we've had about this topic, as far as I know, where we are getting very nuts and bolts and technical in terms of terminology to really kind of break down the process, whether you're trying to be indie or you're trying to be more traditional studio side of things. We're going to talk about that. And obviously, if you have experience or questions, come up on stage and hang out and talk with us. We are going to keep the conversation kind of moving through the outline that we have, but provided we get through it rapidly, then towards the end, I think we'll kind of open up a little bit more broad conversation in terms of like developments or problems, questions, promotions, whatever the case might be. So that would be, I think, everything I have to kind of outline what we're doing. You know, up above in the nest too, there's a few little projects. The last recording of the January workshop for this series is not quite totally available on all platforms. I'm waiting on YouTube. I'll be promoting that later, but it is up on all the other podcast stuff. If you're trying to catch up with the program, those podcast episodes are up on Spotify and YouTube and Audible and Apple Podcasts, which is the one I recommend primarily because that's where, you know, most of my listenership is for the podcast, at least. You know, sometimes there's hits from different angles, but it has become you know, a heavy lifter for me. So I think that's everything to at least get things started as we move into the actual program.
Hell yeah. Yeah. I mean, the other part of this is it's a lot of this is going to be custom to whoever you are. And we're just going to give you various, like, very broad examples, and you can mix and match as you please. Everything's going to be within context of like what exists currently, and what traditionally is still out there that exists within that world. Because at this point, the way that, and I wrote this in a Substack recently, the way that the studio systems and the indie systems are running are very much on equal ground, where nobody really has the idea of what's going to work and what isn't. And they're just literally fighting for attention on either side. And where they mix and match is like when you get Sinners with, you know, how many nominations, and it's a lot of stuff going on where that was very much a voice of somebody fighting for their idea, and it worked. So there's a lot of this that I think is about who you are as a person, because there's a lot of different like roles you can enter into or aspire to get to that may fit better than others. You know, it depends really on what you're about. Now, if you're like me, I'm more of a generalist at this point. It's, you know, there's this auteur type of idea that goes towards like what that role is, and the auteur is more about just like creating the worlds yourself, doing a lot of the stuff yourself. A lot of these people do vlogs. You know, it's very self-oriented. It's very self-driven. With AI now, it's self-driven, and you can build the worlds out. You know, and this is the thing about that role is it's creative, it's administrative, it's the many hats that we were just talking about. And, you know, it's by and large what I think will sustain. And I think that seeing within the last month or two, you know, Darren Aronofsky and I think it's Roger Avery is the right. Well, Darren Aronofsky is the director. Roger Avery is the writer. Talking about AI positively as it's a way for them to get their things done. Names are going to make a difference, and the thing is about those names is they can only last so long. So making a name for yourself will make somewhat of a difference, especially because auteur-driven is something we're very much used to. It's very Pavlovian. So it's an interesting direction. Now, that wears many hats. One of those hats in the creative field is like, you know, writer and director. Well, two of those hats, sorry, is writer and director. You know, where in the creative field, like that's been something that's extremely rich with like, you know, some of the best people in the game, like writing some really interesting stuff and making some really interesting stuff. The thing about it is it's extremely difficult to get into either of those fields. Like, I mean, writing, I mean, Michael could attest to at least some of the writing side of just getting noticed for, even if it's, what do you write, Michael? Is it, would you say it's, I'd say what, mostly nonfiction?
Is original. Some of it is, you know, covers of stuff. But you know, I don't actually have a breakdown. In terms of total releases, though, it's probably about 50-50. And also, I've got a handful of fiction material that's kind of like on deck as well. So yeah, I mean, you know, it's new. Fiction's new for me for sure. Still stretching out into it, but it's coming along. I don't want to say I'm one thing or the other, because I as soon as you say that, you end up finding yourself going in the opposite direction, I feel like.
Oh yeah, well definitely. But even to get noticed in that such situation is quite difficult. It's something you put a lot of like time and effort into, as far as everything you've told me about. And it's one of those things like that's just part of the writing community. There's also screenwriters that have their whole other different hierarchy of shit that they have to deal with. So it's one of those things that as a creative, almost it's always at every one of these levels smarter if you make your own material. And this is what I'd always think, like, AI doesn't change. You don't have to like say, oh, I'm only going to make AI films from now on. You don't have to. You can choose to make one or the other, to do hybrid, to do completely the other for an entire project. But in order to like get these materials out and to kind of flex your muscle a little bit, these are like, especially as a writer and director, because as a writer, just to be able to show you can do pacing, and you can emphasize what shots could be where, even if they're very basic, they don't have a lot of movement, which is fairly easy to do with AI. As long as you can convey the story, that could be the meaning of how you get into that writing community that much better, because that script will have that much more of a calling card to it. And they'll probably want nothing to do with that video, but if they could reissue that script or reuse that IP now for whatever popularity you got for it, there's another calling card within that. And then you can always go the traditional route, write screenplays, submit them to festivals, go to lit agents and managers. It's one of those things, like, you could do the system and you could also do the AI part. They blacklist people for this type of stuff. However, I don't think that that's a very future-proof problem. Like, I don't think it very, very long from now, that's not even going to be an issue. It's all about what you're able to sell to the people in those positions. And that doesn't matter if you use an AI or not. And then, there's the more technical levels and the admin levels. So there's technical levels. You can be very artistic and be a cinematographer. You can be very artistic and be a lighting person, because light and forming light and how to shape it and what to use, and what different lights to use for different things. It can be very artistic, because having set up these systems, it's one of those things where you're now painting with light and you have people to paint with, and knowing these things will also help you with your AI stuff. Because if any of the training is proper, it will know the terms that you will have learned from, having understood it in the real world, whether you do it or not. It's always just good to kind of brush up on it.
Do right now, do we feel like we have addressed kind of the opening components of inspiration, or recognizing the inert or in the internal drive to pursue filmmaking? And I think everybody here has that spark in them for creativity, whatever that might be, whatever it might look like. But I think that there's like some really good stuff there in regards to the well of ideas that we draw from for creativity, and how we manufacture that into consumable media projects for people.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look right now, it's kind of a classic example. One of the top of the charts, I can't believe it is, but one of the top of the box office charts right now is Wuthering Heights, which I don't know when it was taught in junior level high school, but it was taught to my junior level high school. and I absolutely hated that fucking book so much. And I understand why they made a movie. There's it's like very English literature, very bougie type of like love for this book, and I understand that, but it is something that like that's one of the reasons why if you even appreciate anything that's literature wise, that like if you wanted to do something with that, like now's the best time to do it. And it's the easiest, I mean, not the easiest, but it's the best way to express whatever it is that you get out of like whatever inspires you. I mean, and then there's, you know, just the wealth of ideas that are Creative Commons these days. You know, you can tell stories from whatever perspective, and you have the way to do it that you could draw from openly, you know. And I think that that's, if it's just a matter of even not even to be a creative technician, you know, transferring something like that, transmuting something like a piece of literature that's Creative Commons to a movie is a really like just cool way to just try your skills out and see what you could do. And there's a wealth of opportunity out there for that too, because it's, you know, every year there's more and more and more Creative Commons stuff that goes out of you know, copyright. I think Sherlock Holmes is completely out of copyright, and you know, it's why you might see more Sherlock Holmes shows coming up. But you know, that's the thing, riding that wave, it's the studios do it as well as you do it, which is the reason why if you even like whatever you love about storytelling, like if you could draw it into motion, it's the best way to get attention to whatever your art is. You know, to wherever else. It's a good funnel too. And that's the other thing about like being on the more admin side of this as an auteur. You know, if you make anything else, you'll see a lot of platforms are going to start doing this where they're going to have video components, kind of like how Amazon has a video component, where it's just like they have their own kind of stories. WhatsApp has production money out there. You know, there's all these different platforms that are trying to garner some sort of video production to enhance what people get out of their app. Like, and now there's, and it's only a small conversation. Now there's AI short, at least one AI short being played before the before the previews for one of the chains in, I think it's the West Coast. And it's, you know, something that's interesting because now this is a place where things are kind of changing a little bit. Who knows what it's going to lead to? It could lead to absolutely fucking nothing. But this is why getting into filmmaking, there's these new places of showing that are not necessarily new, because we used to do, films used to have before previews, they used to have shorts and cartoons and stuff. So we're getting back to something there. And I think that's why it's important to try and get into filmmaking now, because I really do feel like if one way or another, either through online distribution or through theaters, there might even be pathways back to something that's really interesting and sustainable and cool for, you know, people who like going to the theater and even who doesn't, you know. But that's just my take on that, you know, and it depends on where you want to fit into that. Did I address that like well enough, Michael?
In public domain, lots of old material that has an opportunity to be redressed and revisited. Uh, you know, Shakespeare obviously is still renowned and performed both on stage and on screen in all kinds of different permutations, and it's able to basically be dressed up however you might want, you know, because the human elements, the story elements are classic and timeless in that sense. You know, we should all hope to be able to find things that are classic and timeless in our creativity as well.
Should we move to the more financing the part of things, or are we still kind of in the admin part of, because I don't know if we addressed that fully yet. How do you feel?
Kind of entry into traditional film, and that might be an interesting thing to explore a little bit. For me, I don't have any background in entering traditional film, the industry that way, because I have never done it, and it's not something that I ever found an opportunity with or pursued. Really, the filmmaking thing was um, an offshoot of other work, initially really connected with making music and stuff. The real, I think, entry to it for me, would be Chicago 1893. I hate to go back to that example all the time, but that's where I started with it, explicitly, and it was just sort of a thing that seemed obvious in presenting itself. I wish I could say I had this great inspiration about making this documentary, and I love documentaries, but that's not necessarily how it went. I looked at the material that I had for the book, and I had the audiobook stuff, and is like, well, let's put this stuff together and make a documentary. I love Ken Burns' work. I grew up with it as a kid, and I think a lot of people did too. And to watch it and try to emulate some of that and manufacture something that was hopefully educational, hopefully entertaining, and for me personally, a great exercise, and trying to find ways to improve that or kind of iterate on that material as I have over the last 6 years that's been worked on and released. I think that's a really valuable thing too, where you don't always have to go back to the well for brand new ideas and material. You can kind of keep chopping up what you have and working on it and refining it and changing it or adding to it or subtracting from it and giving something just, these little tweaks to tighten it up or, make it longer for the real fans of it. I think the extended editions of Lord of the Rings are pretty obviously beloved by hardcore fans of that series, and we can do the same thing.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, I got into the industry first as an actor, so my whole thing about it was trying to be in front of the camera. Like, I was trained as an actor for years before I wanted to go to college to do a theater major. That didn't work out because they told me you wouldn't be acting for 3 years, and I was like, I'd rather just go and audition my ass off, and did that for years. And after a while of getting like in the same room with the same looking dudes, I was like, I want to make movies that just have different stories. And that's, where I just was like, all right, this is really where things got interesting, because then doing music videos for people and like really trying to utilize what I learned as an actor from the opposite side of the camera and just do things that I would always have wanted directors that, I worked with to try. But you can't, like, it's not a good hierarchy. Like, you can't say that as an actor. But if you start going behind the camera, you make the fucking decisions. And this is why, it's, later on making it from just being a PA on sets, because then that's how you get in to the major industry, going from PA to a camera PA, and going from a camera PA to being a camera operator, from being a camera operator to a DOP. And, you just keep working project to project. And if somebody needs something for the good credit, and if half your rate, you can go anywhere. So I did that for years, And then when it came time to get close to going union, it was a really difficult situation. It's really competitive. And you're better off in a lot of ways if you want to start a family and stuff like that. You're better off just going independent, which is what I then ended up did. Just, couldn't take those jobs anymore. But that's the thing. At this point, it's so unsustainable that being able to create your own thing is way more potent. And it was always trained upon us to like always have that available. And this is why it's not strange to me where the industry ends up going, because it's just kind of been pushing us there all the time. It was always find your audience and give them what they want, because if they're there to buy it, that's the best way to have it. And that's where I've kind of been for like the last couple of years. The last time I was really in a professional situation was was paid $500 to write a screenplay for somebody. And that was like an actual, like, I actually I put it through the WGA. I registered it with the WGA because you could do that as a non-member. You just register it with them. It doesn't mean anything, but it's one of those things to kind of have as a writer. And sometimes they, foofy people ask for it. But that was the last time I did something professional that wasn't self-driven. But everything else has been self-driven since. And honestly, like now it's come to a point where I think even though these other roles exist, and if you find in your journey you want to go that route, like it's an extremely difficult life. It is a very hard, it's a very hard situation to put yourself in financially, emotionally, for a lot of reasons. But it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever been a part of. Like I would be on set right now if I could, just because like it's just a different energy. But I get, a lot of wins out of, generating really good AI stuff that tells the story, because that's my brain. It goes in both. It's like I'm as much a gearhead as I am a storyteller. So it's why like making stories, if that's your thing, AI is probably your best friend, because otherwise to try and this is the next part we're getting into, which is like whatever your choice is, how to even go about doing anything in that sense. Where the technical ones, it's all about getting in entry level and trying to work your way up. Technicians, you want to be in the lighting department. I would say start as a grip. Try and get to be one of those people in the grip department, because the grip department, all they do is pick shit up and move shit. That's the entire grip department. The lead grip is usually some big dude who could just pick shit up and put something there. That's really every single grip I've ever met. That's exactly who they are. But you can get from that to the lighting department. From the lighting department, you can get to the camera department. You can go through the PA level, because PAs, most of the time, they, are directed by the first AD. The first AD is part of the lead department. Like, that's all a hierarchy that if you want to get part of it, there's multitudes of information out there on how that structure works. You just look for the lowest hanging jobs and expect to be the lowest hanging fruit on any of those poles, and you could literally work your way up. But it's extremely political. It's very, very competitive. It gets shrunken every single day, and it's a hard life. But every win is amazing. That's just the way it is. But that's the thing about what these calls are, because most of those people who are in the industry also have side jobs. Like they'll take independent work all the time. Whereas if you wanted to be hybrid in your AI production, you could find some cinematographers who will do a very, very cheap weekend to just shoot something you want them to shoot, so that you can throw AI over it and you have the performance the way you want it to be, instead of hoping for the AI to do it properly. As good as it's becoming, it's still not what you can get out of an actor who's properly going to move in that way immediately when you tell them to. You don't have to regenerate or nothing. It is probably far more expensive, but who knows at this point with the burns that we have and what to accept. But yeah, I think as far as that call to what you want to do, like that's really what it needs to come from. It needs to come from you first. You need to understand what it is you want out of the situation, what gives you joy. Because I'll tell you, from not being able to be on sets to screenwriting was the last, it still is the last thing I really do enjoy about filmmaking, because it's the best way to tell the story, and it's still so pure. It's still like just the best part of it. And it still could be like, you could do it with AI if you want to, but you could write it yourself, or you can make up the rules, you could break the rules, you could change the whole thing up. You don't have to, like, you're beholden to nobody in the screenplay. And it's one of those places where you can really play with something and really regard whatever the story could be. But that's the thing. It's an auteur. This is going to be another thing to do. If you want to be a writer, this is your main thing to do. So being in that is going to be very difficult. But I think that kind of address it, and then we'll get to the next section.
Yeah, I feel like that's a good. It's new information for me in general.
The roles of what you take on in this way of getting into this industry is just about differentiating like what component of what you handle and what you maneuver, and it's whatever it is you want to be part of. And they all kind of vary in what their directives are and everything like that. But director, writer, producer, and the technicians, and then the admin staff. Like all of these different departments have, and there's the technicians kind of include a lot of different people. I realize, but it's a vast group that just fits within that variable, because as creative as those are, it's mostly an instructional creativity. And the director is the fully, like, you're not just the leader of how the thing looks, you're the leader of the set. And the writer is what enables all of this to be possible, but is mostly left behind after the thing is sold. And the technicians are what make it all possible. Now, you could have those first three roles and then have the technicians and AI and be just one person. Or in indie film, a lot of the time I was the one person when it was just a camera and the talent. And it's variable. That's why it scales up and it scales down. And the reason why you would have different people do those roles is because they're very specialized if somebody can do them well. It's why you'll see certain people extend out a lot better because their producer or whoever they got contact with that understands marketing was able to push this idea a lot further, even though it might not have been like the best idea out there, the most whatever, just whatever reasoning you have that it just doesn't seem like it kind of happened. That's a producer that could be very creative and but the admin staff is beyond that. The people who also do like the sales, the distribution, that's another whole art within itself of business that even the producer might not even be able to be involved with, or might just only be partially involved with. But there's all kinds of different deals that could be made and different distribution models and stuff like that. Doing this by yourself is so difficult, where if you are doing this by yourself, you really should understand what your distribution is and head towards that. Not allow it to be something that's left in the wind. Have it something that you could access yourself. Kind of like Film Hub, which I hate to promote, but it's a way to promote. It's just a way to do some of the things you could do. You could also self-fund a situation with your own film. But yeah, that's one of those things. You should decide distribution as an admin member if you're an auteur of all of it. But whoever you have on staff for this, always have that conversation be open, because it can make the product have a different, I don't know. It depends really on the project, because it could be because you're directing it towards VOD. You don't necessarily need these kind of shots. You can use a lot more intimate shots because your frame is going to most likely be phones and small devices. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to understand that from the outset of what you're doing. But that's what I mean about being admin and producer. Producer comes on and tries to make the thing with you to sell it. The person who's distributing it is going to take what you made and creatively try and find a place for it to go. It is such a beautiful thing when those things work together. I can't even tell you, which is the very few wins you get in film. Michael, if you want to talk about your adventures in distribution land, feel free. Film Hub, just on its own, we could probably do an hour on Film Hub. But, like, how important would it be to have somebody who just does that for you and you just hand it off to them?
it's certainly a role in traditional. Do It is a very complex aspect of filmmaking. I think it is in any of the creative fields the most critical component of what you're doing, because it's where you monetize, and it's also where the audience connects. But in terms of the kind of earlier phases of, say, financing, making those choices and how you explore the choice that you make, how you kind of drill down into those choices, I think that's probably where we need to redirect to, prior to a more extended conversation about distribution.
But I think you can appreciate that part of the admin staff, at least in that aspect, just to even know that they would do that all for you.
Yeah.
But this is heavily dependent on. So the thing I was going to acquiesce to is this is all heavily dependent on what your risk aversion is in any which way. Because the thing about doing any of these levels is it really depends on what you're out to do. If you're money first about literally anything, I would heavily, heavily recommend you stay in the technician field and try and fight in that realm to get as far into that, to get more creative freedom later on. Just because it's the job that has the money first. You are the labor of the production. It is one of those things that I cannot tell you how valuable it is to walk into a production knowing by the end of the day you're going to have a check in your hand. That is, as an actor, you're a laborer. That's exactly what it felt like. It was like you go in, you dress the way they tell you to dress, they approve you before you go on set, and it's bing, bang, boom. And I will tell you that as far as getting into the industry, it is the most reliable part of the industry because you are the labor. But there's a lot of value in that. It was one of the reasons why I approached being a technician, is because you get access to people at a different level. And it doesn't matter what it is you do. If you're a craft services person, if you cook, like, you will find a way to get into this situation because there's so many different ways that they are looking for ways to get in, like, people to feed their people. And I know many craft services people that have had favors done for them because of that situation. It really doesn't matter. It's all about the relationships you make along the way. The technicians, heavily so, because you can make very, very fast money, not a lot of money, but very, very fast money, being very approachable in that sense. And as far as entering the industry, if you're really just about money and money only, and your creativity is about trying to get to, like, major studio financing as that's your goal, you don't want to try and self-finance at all, like, that's a money first industry that has a really good access rate. It doesn't have a success rate. You'll get in, they'll chew you up, and they'll spit you right back out. That's the bad parts of that industry. You are the labor, and very much so, they are a revolving door immediately as far as the low end labor, because lots of people are very flaky about this industry. They'll get in, they'll see how hard it is, how little they're getting paid, and they'll be popped right back out. But I will tell you, if you're a single person just trying to make it like that, it can get you through. It can. But yeah, it's one of those things that's very difficult. And that's the thing about the money part of this, if you're only about making money for whatever and maybe doing something with major studio, that's the way. Technicians are the strongest way to do that. Because even the other parts of what we're going to cover, so, like, if you are an auteur, almost everything you're doing is going to be split between two different things in the very beginning, which is either self-funding your entire thing, or crowdfunding it. And these are not new. This is something that every single filmmaker that has ever lived has dealt with in one way or another. Even though there's major studio financing, there's people like Francis Ford Coppola who was making fucking Apocalypse Now, and they ran out of money. And you don't go back to the studio because the studio is probably going to tell you to go fuck yourself. But you have to then find it from somebody. And that's basically what crowdfunding is finding somebody with money and having them give enough of it to you that you can go make your thing. Now we make it as many somebodies, but it's not a new thing. And then self-funding, I mean, Francis Ford Coppola, he just made a great film that he financed himself. The man who was always in trouble
what a monolith. Honestly, I love that movie, and I love the story behind that movie. And you know, to be that driven to sink so much money and effort into making this movie that, let's be honest here, the reaction didn't justify the investment at theaters and streaming and all the rest. And gosh, you know, how long will it take to make that money back? I don't care, because the entertainment value of the movie for me personally as a viewer, way up there. And this is something that we talked about, you know, while we were texting last night too, because it popped up on Tubi for me, was the Don Quixote of Terry Gilliam, and just making the connection between those two films and the drive those two filmmakers had to get that work produced and released and out there for audiences, and there being kind of this unifying factor of those two films featuring Adam Driver as the lead. And it, you know, I think I fell asleep for Don Quixote, I'm going to be honest, but it started getting late, you know, let's be clear here. It was late when I started it, and I was very tired, but he's great, and those movies are great, and they're not just like popcorn watches, you know what I mean? They're like people that really are interested in craft and story and performance. There's so much there to dig into from the casts and the process. And if you haven't watched those, and another one that I'll mention too is Babylon, which was fantastic. And these are movies that have been dogged on in the recent years, for whatever reason, one or another, you know, the case might be, unfortunately and short-sightedly. But these guys are out there as legends. I mean, would anybody dispute Terry Gilliam being a legend? I'm not. And the fact, his catalog of stuff is wild when you really look at it. Go watch those movies if you haven't. And I think that, like, when you scale it down to the stage of things that we are here locally at, it is the same sort of scenario where you're like, can I afford to manufacture this vision that I have? And am I going to self-finance that, self-fund it? Can I get other folks to help me realize the vision? Or do you need to go talk to a major studio about it? And, you know, good luck. I mean, let's examine the last half decade, certainly since COVID, that they have been kind of, I would say, hitting the wall, and having a very, very difficult time of kind of turning things back onto the level that they were at prior. And will they be able to do that? Yeah, maybe, if they stop cutting themselves off at the knees with streaming platforms. That seems really great. The comfort, you know, being able to do it at home. But I'm going to tell you this, like, we as viewers, we're going to pay more for streaming than we're going to pay for the theater ultimately, because you can choose, you know, you can make the very particular choice about what you're going to go to the theater for. Whereas with streaming, they're going to serve you whatever. And these streaming platforms are, I would say, dicing up the talent and the manufacturing to the point where they're trying to replicate what cable was before. And, you know, who loved cable back in the day? I mean, let's say as streaming was coming on, cable was becoming a dirty word. So inside of that aspect is the relationship with financing and where you're going to have to, you know, come to terms with how you want to get that done, I think.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, this is what it'll relate later to other things we want to talk about, but these decisions, you know, it's it's something where if you look at anything, you're going to look at comps. You try and look at comparable projects around your area. There's no shortage of it. Whatever your project is, there's always somebody else who's tried to do it, who's accomplished it, who's not accomplished it. You could always find comparable. And you could also shoot for the stars. Something like a Markiplier with Iron Lung is a $3 million production, is $50 million return on investment. $50 million worldwide intake for box office. So that's more than 10x its budget. Marketing was barely anything because the guy has the audience to build it up. It was one of those things that if you just look at that scale and you scale it down to as low as possible, you can always try and find numbers that kind of make sense with what you relatively have to go, what you have going on. And there's always about building that up to get more out of that situation. So, self-financing is all about what you already have and what you really could take in and how you could build on that. And it is the most time-consuming part of this whole situation, but it's the one way to own absolutely everything. And it's one of those things that even with ultimately self-financing, if you have the money, then that's, this is the investment you make. If you don't have the money, you're saving up. I've done this twice over. I had two shorts. They each cost one cost $3,400 and one cost $2,700 because I minimized a lot of shit. But it was the same story. It was like one location scene, and the two shorts had two actors each. I went for more of a drama the first time, an action type of like thriller type of thing the second time, and that was just for screen testing to like get more people to understand what I could do with a crew, because that's what it costs to just get a crew together and do that. I mean, I've never made that money back, and I never probably will. But the thing about it is I love those projects. They did so much for what like I really love doing about like making movies. And and now with AI, there's a whole bunch of things I would want to add to them. Because there were shots that I tried to accomplish that I didn't really, have the means to do because it was a $2,700 production. So it was one of those things that it's like self-financing you own everything end to end. I paid the composer, I paid the sound guy the first time, I didn't do a sound guy the second time, paid the actors, paid for the location. I used the Airbnb trick, but it wasn't a trick. Like I told the guy what I was doing. I just booked it through Airbnb and he was like, no problem. Both times it was just like, they just got it. As long as I paid the cleaning fee and the night fee, I had no problems whatsoever. And it was a great shoot just to be able to have a location that's meant for people. So it's one of those things, self-financing, you control everything, you own everything. It is such a great way of doing it if you have the means to do it. But you could also go to Vegas and gamble it away and probably have a lot more fun, like in a very justifiable way. But I loved making those shorts, and any like small production I've ever been on where it's not me paying into it, but I'm not taking any money for it. It's one of those things you feel invested in it too. So self-financing is one of those things that I can't recommend it enough if you have the means to do it. But if you have the means to do it, be prepared that like 99.9% of every production doesn't make money back, like the most. So, yeah. Which also leads to the other part, which is crowdfunding. The crowdfunding part is really, it's great and it's scary at the same time. We the Film3, the whole idea of Film3 is being able to kind of crowdfund a project through the use of NFTs or cryptocurrency tokens, whatever. So, this idea of being able to crowdfund through that and not have any ROI is a really simple transactional, like, you pay me, maybe you offer the film or whatever it is. That's the crypto way of doing it. There's also Kickstarter. That is the most ubiquitous way of doing it. I think they take, I forgot what their percentage is. I think it used to be 15%. I don't know if it still is. But they take a percentage, whatever it may be, whatever you're signing, please make sure you read it. They take a percentage for hosting you on their platform, for having access to their audience, essentially. And you just take your chance on that market. You can also crowdfund through a bunch of other methods. You can do it through PayPal has like, just pay me type of method where you just accept payments and you figure that out. You can do it through Gumroad in a lot of ways because you offer something with it, like somebody buys something and it's something that it goes towards an overall fund, and you can do it through as transparent as you want. It's the other thing about Web3 is there's a level of transparency you can have at that layer or not. And then, crowdfunding is also just the same way we just talked about Francis Ford Coppola. If you know a couple of rich people that would finance something like that, look up your local laws. None of this is, financial or legal advice, but, see what that's about. It's, another way. It's you meet somebody who has the means, however you find out, whatever it is, that's another way of crowdfunding. You'll hear stories like that. Oh, we found the money. They don't just like go outside and it's in a bag. They had to call somebody and they essentially further crowdfunded, added another person to the credits. And that's another like kind of crowdfunding method as a bunch of people put money together and make something. And then there's the major studio financing, which those two other things could very well lead to that if you do them in a way to approach that, because that's been the way it's happened before. Tarantino, very famously, the Pulp Fiction, he made the one scene, sent it out to a bunch of people, and they were like, yeah, we're going to do this with the script. And yeah, they went for it. They went hard for it, And a lot of people, shorts are kind of their calling card, and it's just sometimes if it's either a short or a different way, like Evil Dead is probably the most classic way to explain it, because Evil Dead 2 is almost the exact same movie except the more production value than the first Evil Dead. And it's one of those things that they literally upgraded the story is basically all they did. They added very little to it where it was almost the same exact movie. But the thing about that is that happens even without somebody retelling the same story. There's also adaptations. The big thing about these days is adaptations. If you can write something decent about a book that could be adapted openly, Creative Commons, major studios love when there's already installed audience and you write something that could really be celebrated. But that takes such an enormous amount of politics to get to. It is the hardest thing to fight for. Yeah, Michael, sorry.
No, I just think that you're at a good transition point to talk about establishing audience. And I think that the turn into that side of things is a really valuable one too, where you want to think about front loading that. And if you're pitching for financing or if you're pitching for participation or whatever, let's talk about how projects are getting financed or greenlit depending on who is participating in relationship to their social media followers and presence. There's social capital that is financing films at this point because they're looking at these individuals have audience that are going to participate in whatever projects as a viewer or a buyer or just somebody who's going to additionally influence attention towards a project in advance of it coming out.
And that's exactly where you have to be after you decide any of this, because that audience, no matter how big or small or where, is going to decide how this all goes. The thing about being a technician is the social media following almost doesn't matter. And I think many technicians would say that it almost hurts you to have a heavier social following because then you make the company look whatever way. But the technicians, as far as their audience, they need to stay within the industry people. They like whoever is a lead or a head or whoever is what. That your audience in that situation is the insiders at the lowest end of the trade pool in film. And you have to live in a hub city to make that really possible. But hub cities are growing. Los Angeles and New York are no longer the giant hub cities they used to be. If you live far enough or close enough, whatever enough that you can travel to a hub city like Atlanta, New Orleans, Albuquerque is kind of starting to go out. London is very poppin'.
Did you mean to do that?
What?
London Poppin', Mary Poppins.
No.
Oh, all right.
Oh, I did that totally by accident.
Just serendipity.
fucking but yeah, this is the thing about that is like if you live in any of those hub cities, if you're a technician, it's just about finding wherever those people are. And most of the time when you get bookings or you look up for any of the jobs that are posted, it's always the lowest rung, and you just try and figure out where those people are, and your audience is that group of people. And you just need to be that person for that group of people. And then the other, now establishing an audience anywhere for anything else, if you're doing self-funding or crowdfunding, like it's really just depends on where you want your audience to be, and where you spend the most time. Because honestly, it should always be where you're already invested the most into. And then as far as where you want your audience to be, it should be wherever that is. Like if your audience is within that group, then that's where you should be. Like I more spend my time on X. My audience would probably be within the crypto and AI community within X. That's anytime you look at the buckets that you want to fulfill, like just always try and be honest with yourself about where those buckets are. And then, there's nothing wrong with cross posting and such like that, but always make sure you're investing in places that pay back. If you invest in a place that's really just kind of hanging out there dead and not really doing anything that's worth it or useful, maybe change your mind, see what works better. And this is just basically in the self-funding, crowdfunding, very low indie part of this situation where you're just literally looking for audience on wherever platform you are most active. And that's really the best way to do that. It should just be kind of basic. Now, the other part of building that audience is trying to figure out where you can bring them value and however that works for you. And that's the thing about establishing an audience. You have to try and make good on doing that. And whatever that is for your audience, you have to just figure out, like, try stuff out. People don't want to buy one thing, they want to buy another. That's it. It's cool. It's all about what the data is and figuring that out and trying to be really open to how things are accepted or received. And then, bouncing back with something new and trying out something different. And the thing is that if you do this at any stance, at whatever level, if you use whatever tools, it doesn't matter because it's still all about trying to do that for that audience. It's, no amount of tools is going to make that much easier to see than anything except seeing. You have to actually put it out there, try things out, take the idea that it might not work, and then bounce back and try and refigure it. And that's for both of those situations between the self-funding and the crowdfunding. Like there's almost nothing different about that. The only difference really is that in crowdfunding, your intention is to make the money back to make good on whatever that crowdfund level was to do a next thing. Until you establish something like, with the SEC, whether you do a regulation crowdfund or whatever, the ROI on that, you have to always check with your regulatory rules and regs, but the idea is to not be paying anybody back in a more traditional sense. Reg CF is very rare. I don't know why. It should be done way more often. They should be figuring out how to give everybody who partakes on a film a piece of the pie at the end. But that's just me. But crowdfunding, traditionally, there's not a real understanding of getting the money back unless you do like I was saying earlier, if you know people and they're financing your film, that's a situation you work out with them. Always contact a lawyer, accountant, somebody who knows about this shit when you're doing this, because you have to anyway to register. So the major studio financing is one of those things that as a technician you can get, but as a creative, you really just need an entry point into that situation, which is why it gets really about audience. It gets really difficult to say, like, how that, I said as a technician, you can get there, but as a director, as a writer, as a producer, like these are one of those high level things that could come from, there's a multitude of ways you can get that audience properly. It all has to do with if you decide to do festivals and you play the politics there properly, whatever you make that you either self-funded or crowdfunded, or maybe some minor, some studio financing came to you and was able to help you make it. Like, those people who are at that big audience level are usually at those festivals or are watching the major stage of wherever, if you make money. Like I could tell you, the guy Markiplier I was talking about earlier, he made $50 million. I could promise you by the time he made his money back, there were already people contacting him to be part of whatever the next thing he does, because that's how it goes. They watch the major markets. And that's why I always explain to people to try things, because establishing your audience is sometimes the strongest way to get through the whole self and crowdfunding part to the major studio financing. You know, it's one of those things that you just have to be on somebody's radar in some cases, but it depends on a lot of factors. But that's the thing about establishing the audience, is it's important at every level, especially if you want to be a creative producing type of person. For most of the roles, you kind of going to have to do a lot of these things anyway. Like even if you strictly wanted to be a director, there's going to be a point where you're going to have to acquiesce to your public or to other people in the directing world. There's just only so many places to do that before you're a major director, and then you're already in the scene, and socially you'll be seeing these people. So, audiences building is a very difficult thing. It's very difficult in general. It's not depending on anything. It's just always difficult. It all depends on how you approach whatever that audience is. Like that's the thing. I just do whatever bonkers and crazy things come out of my fucking head. So it's one of the things that if you're a fan of mine, that's just the way I work. The things I'm interested in and the things I very much like aesthetically, if you're there for it, you're there for it. And I think that's where I can't go back to the studio system. I have to see what VOD and sustainability on the low end looks like, and putting out work that I want to just maybe locally produce something that would go on a theater screen. Because that's the other part of being your own self-funded operation, is you can get as creative as you like about however you do that. It's whatever your risk assessment is and how much you could spend or how much you make. And the crowdfunding, it's one of those things that until you make that money, you don't make those decisions. It's all about till the money changes hands to you. But when you're self-funded, there's a lot of like really crazy things that you could do that might end up working for just your situation. That's why I always, if you're going to look into something as a self-funded individual who's trying to make stuff, look at resource filmmaking. And I mean this even for people who use AI, because there's so many ways that you can use those lessons learned of resource filmmaking to basically influence your AI generations. If you have a great location near you, it'll just help that work. But yeah, so this is kind of the audience building, and it's why it's very difficult to like lock down on one, just because there's so many different ways. Because you could even become a social media influencer and get involved in the trades and all that other stuff. They have some social people that are out there. It's just something I've always heard be an issue, but it depends. It depends. There's the aspects of like like with Web3, where Web3 audiences are might influence where you need to be. If you're not necessarily on X, but you really like Web3 technology, sorry to tell you, but X is probably the only platform beside Telegram where you're really going to get anything out of that.
You don't love Farcaster anymore?
Oh my God. I mean, I'm on there. I'm back again, but it is not booming whatsoever.
Yeah, it is what it is. I mean, I think that it shouldn't be ignored. I think there's probably a conversation about marketing to be had, later in the year, but at least for now, trying to get a presence where, as you were saying, like a presence where it's best applied, that would be, it's better to start now than to have to start after and try and catch up or put together a strategy in the 11th hour. So I would say, be cognizant of what is available to you for free or cheaply before having to do heavy lifting with money or favors or whatever the case might be. I think we look at a lot of these movies when they're kind of touting these production numbers and the return in the box office, and then you discover that, like, oh, they dumped just as much money into marketing, which is insane, that it costs that much to attempt to reach an audience to validate the expenditure for those films, which is astronomical in some cases. Again, maybe streaming turns out to be the ticket for you. But put a little bit of consideration in at the beginning so you don't have to scramble after the fact. For me, the stuff I've done, sometimes it goes out to events, or, I did a premiere for the Chicago 1893 documentary a number of years ago now. But that kind of stuff is also not something that you can just, hope works out or turns into deeper relationships or massive audience. Again, Film Freeway, a great resource for finding festivals and events to participate in, but also costly to submit to many of those. And if you're going to have to budget for that, or you're trying to tour your film around the festival circuit, or even just tour your film like a band, trying to find theaters that'll put you on and maybe do a door split or whatever the case might be, that was what we called it back when I did bands. We were looking for venues, or, booking acts and putting on events and stuff like that. You have to find out how the finances are going to work out in advance of even agreeing to the contract with the booking promoter for some touring act that wants X amount of money, because otherwise that's coming out of your pocket. You're signing a contract with them and you want to make them whole and make their tour successful, or as successful as you can, given maybe the level of things that they're at. And film is the same way. We are in that indie scene. We are attempting to develop audience, get our projects out into the world. And definitely recommend developing the relationships you need in advance. For me, the documentary came out in 2020. I did the premiere in 2022. I couldn't do the premiere any earlier. There were no theaters that were going to put me on during that time. I got really lucky, plainly, to be able to do the premiere with an audience inside of a nice theater with good sound. And again, it's not, it wasn't like going to the AMC. It was a small theater. I think there were maybe 70 seats, 75 seats. I don't know exactly. I don't recall. Were they filled? No, they weren't filled, but there was a good crowd there who were interested in what I had made, and predominantly did not know me at all. I think, maybe, let's say, a quarter of the people knew me in some way, like we had communicated in some fashion. The rest of them were total strangers that facility helped promote and get out into the seats. And again, consider this stuff. I think Chris has talked about an example in the past involving a guy who had made some films that were about skiing, and he would tour that film around, and that, he kept busy with that. That's such a great example. That's just like being in a band fundamentally. And you do need to approach it. Like, it's cool to be in the band, you know what I mean? But I, as a musician for a good long time, I wasn't trying to play for free, and I wasn't trying to break even, on playing music. I can break even or play for free at home. I can play the songs for myself at no added cost or frustration of moving gear or whatever. So you do want to consider those economics, not only in terms of the production, but the audience and the messaging to reach that audience about your production.
Yeah, exactly. You see, the thing that is kind of also becoming quite apparent through the major market is that wide distribution doesn't necessarily work the same way anymore. Mark Plyer was able to get to 2,000 screens, which is a pretty high fucking number. And it's one of those things that there's even more than that. And I think the other part of making this sustainable is this idea of what your distribution looks like from whatever you have relatively. If it's one of those things that if majority of your audience is online, then your distribution online is kind of clear and simple. If you find that there's a lot of local love for whatever it is you do, then your distribution should at least address the idea of what that would look like, because that's the thing about where we're at, is that theaters, as much as I don't think they have a very long future, I hope I'm wrong, but while we have them and while they're available, and especially while they're hurting, if you could find a way to have an event at a theater and it be an amicable price between you and whoever is managing that schedule, like, try and work it out. Because even for the love of the theater to do it, but the other part is to have that kind of experience in whatever. There's also, like what Michael was saying, used to go to the Katra Festival in downtown Manhattan a lot, and the Katra Festival was just random short films being shown in succession in a room, like kind of a bar, that would just literally dim the lights, put on a projector, and just like 10 films at once. And you meet the filmmakers, you talk to them. Sometimes they had prizes, sometimes people would finance like the bar for the night. There was all kinds of things that they made it worth it to go to. And I went to that event 4 or 5 times. It was just, that's something I went to. But it's one of those things that also think about your other creators. The thing about why I was so adamant about getting a group of creators together is to try and bank resources in whatever way possible. And that idea is something that in your distribution and promotion could very well help as well. And really, sharing audiences, sharing ideas, sharing capabilities, crossing paths in whatever form, in whatever sense. And I think that's important for getting distribution out there on a very small level, because a lot of our audiences are very different, we are all very different people. So it's one of those things that when you're thinking about distribution, think about, as much as the resource filmmaking, the resource distribution, think about whatever you have most access to. Major distributors aggregators is as low as it can be. It's one of those things that I think Film Hub is what, $100 a month, Michael?
Film Hub is free, in fact.
Yeah, but okay. I mean, the version where they actually push your stuff.
I have no idea. It might be $1,000 a year or something. And let's be clear. I don't know that what you're getting there is worth that money. I would not go so far as to say that they are pushing your film if you are paying that money. What I think you are getting more of, if you are paying the fee, is assistance with checking all the boxes in terms of your project being easy for the people, the buyers at these platforms, to interpret and to evaluate for, streaming, for them to pick it up in that sense. So I've tried, I think, 3 or 4 times to get something through on there. I've gotten one thing through on there with their assistance. Let's be clear. I don't pay. They help me out. I'm very appreciative of that help. The Anunnaki is distributed through there to 2 platforms currently. A third evaluated it. They did not pick it up so far. Maybe that'll happen in the future. I don't know. If it does or it doesn't, that's okay. I'm just happy that I finally got one through their system. And, to me, that's a win. Is it making a lot of money? I'll tell you now, it isn't. But it is a small personal win. And to be able to say, I've got 3 films or videos or shorts or however you want to phrase it, projects in streaming distribution, is at least a couple of small notches on the belt for me in regards to being a filmmaker. Whatever that means, I guess. The same thing goes for saying I have X number of books out. I'm self-published. I don't have a traditional publishing deal, but again, let's think about really like developing flywheels for ourselves where we have enough projects out there, we're kind of reaching critical mass, and people are able to discover us, through search or through persistence, or just how much we have out there. It's hard or impossible to avoid us as independent entities making things and trying to develop an audience in that sense. So yeah, the distribution and promotion conversation is very in depth. I know that we'll talk about this much more later this year. I think that kind of you can look at today as really kind of a rubric, the syllabus for the entirety of the year, and we'll go down many other avenues, but at least that narrative arc is probably best explored today as we've been doing it. Distribution, there are a lot of nuts and bolts. It is, I don't want to say it's designed to stop you up, but it certainly is complex. And distributing a film with the requirements is far and away the most complex thing that I have ever distributed, whether that is music, magazines, books. You got to make sure all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed, because these people are looking at these checklists and legitimately they're trying to make it easy for not only you who are a content provider, but also their other customers who are content buyers. They're just trying to make it easy for all of us to meet in the middle. Now, that doesn't mean that the individuals are always easy to deal with, and who am I? But they are trying to make that bridge happen, because that's their bread and butter too, is helping people meet in the middle to get distribution, find a catalog, and take a slice. That's their whole bit. So they do want their slice, so in that case they have to make sure to help the bridge get made.
For sure. Just for Distribution Plus on Film Hub is $2.99 every 3 months, so $100 a month. Distribution Pro is $5.99 every 3 months. Prioritize quality control reviews, channel blocking, not affect the title's ability to generate revenue as per their site.
I was just going to say they're kind of the only game in town for that. There are other distributors, but it is much more relationship based than platform based. So if you're going to get into that side of things, you need to be prepared for those variations, I would say.
Distribution is one whole step, but once it is distributed or whatever after it is wherever you want it to be, ultimately there's more to just keeping that alive and keeping that going than just having it out there. There's always things about like getting more people to watch it, getting more people to know about it, getting more people to interact with it in some way, and whatever else you got fucking going on, because these are the things, like when you have it, the Film Hub, just putting it on YouTube, like any of those factors where reaction comes from the essentially the world, the universe. It's one of those things that reviews are important, and you don't need to approach people for it, but the people that do that, the thing about each of these levels is if you're doing that yourself, it's a very difficult thing that you hopefully want to get organically. However, at the highest level, there is a lot of focus grouping for every film that you've ever seen that's come out of a major studio. So the thing about focus grouping that's really important is you can get a lot of data from screening this thing in front of a group of people. So if you have friends who you want to get reviews from, and maybe that's more of your critique process, and you'll turn it into a review maybe when the thing is finally out into the world. Like, there's always ways of making that work. Try and get involved with people. Like, it's one of those things that getting involved with other filmmakers, grouping together, stuff like that, you have people that maybe could duplicate their role with however you work together. If it's somebody that you really trust, you show them something that's nearly done or it's done, or you just need, eyes on it. You'd be like, hey, could I have and I copy this for a review for the, for whatever, for my site or whatever it is. Work that out. And then something like, even further is getting the word out there. You need to leverage whatever other media you possibly can. And, Spaces is great. We're going to have, I don't know if I need to knock on wood. I doubt it, because he seems like he's a good dude. There's this guy, Ian, who I think anybody who's in the space would have heard about him. He's got 30K. He's making an AI film. We're going to have him on. He has a long history of being a filmmaker, but I want him to come on to this to whatever, promote whatever he's doing, whatever film that is, however that works. Going on podcasts, it's a thing that media that lives forever. And unlike Spaces, it's mostly, platform, friendly. It's just, if it's on Spotify, it's on Apple Music, it's on whatever, it's it has so many different facets of it. And that's if you're funding, if you're crowdfunding, these are your best friends right there, because getting reviews, getting something that goes to SEO and making that work and all that other stuff, and getting on podcasts and trying to get that media out there, it builds up. Or even if that project does very little or nothing or whatever, it is a thing to build upon. No creator has a perfect strategy that works every time. And then there's always, the thing about it, every level of this is the top down does the same thing. They get reviewers, they get people who are professional reviewers, film critics, they like to call themselves, and they put themselves in a situation to tell them about the film. They do promotion through every fucking means they possibly can. And, it's a really big machine, but you can interact with that machine too.
Let's talk about the leaks around Marvel's Doomsday project that were kind of coming out over the holidays. I think it was kind of running from December to January, and you would see these little images or little clips of things, and they were coming from explicitly influencers in the scene, and it was clearly obvious that they were being fed this stuff from some internal channel to hype up the series of promotional videos that they were putting into theaters at the same time. And they were low quality, so you couldn't necessarily make everything out, or, you could, the wild speculation, algorithmically, I'm sure a lot of people were served this stuff. I was, it's hard to avoid these kind of coordinated promotional efforts from juggernauts like that. And, will it be cool? It'll be spectacle for sure. We're going to watch the pixels light up. That's cool. I'm fine with it. But that kind of strategy where they were doing kind of the old school idea about a viral campaign, going back to, say, some of what Nolan did around The Dark Knight and stuff like that, where that really came from. Instead of just saying oh, it went viral. It's well, it was very popular, but was it a clandestine operation with sort of cryptic undertones, or some kind of thing that was not necessarily 100% apparent to casuals? I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say just because something is popular, it's viral. That, to me, I think there's a little bit of a definition departure there. Who am I? Doesn't matter.
Well, the only thing I'll say about that is there's the show, and then there's the performance. And I think there's value in leaking something, quote unquote. And I think there's also a play that you could do that in your own kind of way. You just develop the story along with your audience and just try and keep them interactive with it. And I think that's the value in it. And I think that's also why it's so powerful that we could be so immersive these days in so many different various ways. And that's the thing about like getting beyond your regular strategies to try and promote whatever it is you do is like interesting ways of making that work. It could be a comic book because you could print on demand comic books these days. It could be a zine. You could make that with a piece of regular printer paper. There's tutorials out there to slice, cut, and fold something that could be a little magazine that you could send to people that could be part of your plot, your story, your idea. There's NFTs, there's 3D printing. There's all kinds of different ways to go beyond your normal strategies to get there. And that's the thing. It's all about trying to tell that story better. And marketing could be very much the same part of it. But yeah, I think it's valuable to always think about your distribution in whatever way to feed your audience, just because that's just the way my mindset is. But there's also understanding how the big boys do it and trying to utilize that. Because another thing that somebody who is a really good marketing person once told me about when we were talking about like what the future of marketing was when social media was just started to come out, he is like, it's going to come to a point, and it's at this point now, where everybody's going to need content all the time. So the idea of doing something unique and weird within any situation is worth it to do for the idea that possibly somebody could have needed that content and reused it while you are also doing it. I think about the things that happened on like what Omegle or whatever it is that like it was a it was webcam, and it was one of those things where there were all kinds of different ways of they tried to do promotions through that, where they would have somebody turn into a monster in front of people and stuff like that. There's ways of doing that through Twitter. There's ways of doing that through Instagram. There's ways of doing that through every means. You could always just develop the character and make it happen. If you need structure on how to do that, think about Ernest P. World, or Pee Wee Herman in a lot of ways, because they're especially Ernest was made as a character to promote other items. It was just kind of like it was out of the blue, random, and it caught on to be its own IP. If you think about things in that sense, that you can make something happen like that for your own products, there's so many facets of how to do that now with AI. It's insanely easy. But even if you're not about AI, just trying to create that thing. And there are people who have just done that. It's like they've done that with their careers. Nicolas Cage is traditionally Nicolas Cage. Like that's his ethos and his mythos have met in the middle. And now we have this person that has its own like preceding connotation to it. And that's a strategy within itself to be that type of person. And engage with your community in that way. That's the other part of it, is that any of these strategies that you have to make sure your community wants to be part of it. And, that's where testing comes in. That's why they do focus grouping for the major films, is to try and see how any Joe Schmo who does these things regularly, and I think tests on a very regular level the way they want them to test, which is my problem with focus groups at the big level. But then it's also down to like community could also be part of your screening process, where especially if you're making something with the community, like give them access, allow that to be part of the transaction, the other strategy, find a way for that to work. You could do that. There's a multitude of different ways to do it. There's so many. There's like unlisted links on YouTube. Like that's the easiest way to do it, where you can send it to somebody and, you have to trust this person. If they've paid into your community somehow, they use it. But a lot of this like different stuff is all about engaging with that community properly and finding a way to, and even if it's just other filmmakers, other people who are creatives, like it's worth it to get into that only because that's who you're going to promote to, because those people are the ones that, like, if they stick around, hopefully they get something out of that thing, whatever it may be, as far as the film, as far as the serial, as far as whatever creative idea you have. Now, at the very highest level audience like that doesn't matter, but it's still feeding your fellow filmmakers in the same way. Engaging with them on a proper level is a whole other situation. It's like going to conferences. Every conference I've ever been to, whether it's film or construction, there's all these like bonding moments that happen. Being on podcasts, being on panels for podcasts. Sometimes it gets you and another person in a conversation and, you make a friend that way. Just being on X, going in spaces and talking to people. Sometimes you find somebody who has a really cool fucking documentary idea and you're like, wow, I really hope that person stays in touch. And they do, and they become part of your team, and you work together on various insane things together. It's all dependent on how you feed that community, because it could also be multi-layered. Where on a technician level, doing that in the IRL type of way and making sure that happens, where you're doing favors for people and engaging with your community there in that way, or in our sense, where we're not only here to try and show people stuff, we also want to share other people's work. We want to try and help people do better work. We want to like see what other work people are doing and try and like support them in another which way, whatever that is possible. It's that version, it's that flavor that is us engaging with the community. But on the other hand, it's what I would be doing anyway on Twitter, really. But that's another whole part of why you should do things where you're most comfortable, where you're most available. But that's why distribution matters. It depends on where you want to go with whatever. Because if I wanted to do something physical, I don't even really know where my audience would be aside from going back to Brooklyn. But that's an old audience that has nothing to do with my creativity. I think as an audience, I've got a lot of varied places because I'm more on the technical side than creative side. But that's the thing. It's a matter of choosing these things and how they come and trying to do with what you can and figuring out what that means for you. And, my story could be your story could be something totally different, and that's the whole kind of beautiful thing about getting into this industry is it really is custom to you. It's your hero story. It's anything you create, any way you do this, you're the one at the end that either gets to feel the joy of victory or the cruel feeling of defeat, but it's the journey there is really important, and you learn a lot from failures. So always take a failure in with a lot of grace, because failures can teach you what not to do again, and there's things that I will do again just because I feel that way, but I have to know that. And that's what getting into this industry, understanding what we were talking about and how if the marketing really is that attractive or this is that attractive or none of that shit's attractive and you fucking hate all of it. You want to just make slop. Like if this drove you to never want to be that creative, I'm sorry, but I love you. And whatever slop you want to make, go for it. But that's kind of the way it is about this industry. You can go in a lot of different directions. You can go in no direction, but getting your creativity and being able to exercise it with these tools and these methods, even throughout the admin process, the distribution promotion process, the whole, like the admin part of it, that could be creative in a lot of ways. But I don't know, Michael, is there something we should go more in depth into towards this like end part of this here?
Yeah, I think that, again, your points are valued and appreciated. We do understand. Networking is critical, and you don't know who you're going to cross paths with or how you can help each other to kind of get your projects further out there or advanced, developed, started at all. You don't know what sort of serendipity will strike by just starting the conversation, and seeing how it goes from there. The thing there is, that's something that it doesn't end either. It kind of goes on in perpetuity. So make a little effort here and there. It won't hurt you. I do think that is the end of what we have outlined, at least for today. And, for the folks hanging out, listening, thank you for being patient with us and hanging out and letting us kind of riff. These are sessions. These are little workshop sessions that we're doing and recording and then putting them out as podcast episodes. So again, the one from last month has been loaded up, but I think, let me just double check here while we're talking. I was waiting on YouTube to get it done. Oh, look at that. It's finished. So all of the platforms are now live. I'll be putting posts out about that shortly here, maybe while we're hanging out even. And you can go revisit where we started the series. And, now that you've heard this one, maybe add some context or some criticisms of what we're doing. And that's fine. We'll listen to that and try and steer it as best we can. We have a plan. That's the thing. And the other important note is that these need to be valuable for you guys if you're going to spend the time with us and hang out, so I think you should get some of what you want. And certainly, by design, we should be getting what we want out of them, which is to flesh out the ideas and have a recording at the end. But this is a community. This is a network, and there is a give and take. And hopefully you guys like the give, which is making the space and coming up with the topics and the material and finding guests and putting stuff out there to evaluate and appreciate and enjoy or hate on, if you even made it, if you don't have haters. So yeah, I think that's good for the meantime.
I just want to finish with a story particularly about networking, but also about what you do with creativity. Where I used to work, they rented the space for a production of that was known as American Gangster. American Gangster starred Denzel Washington. It also had Clarence Williams III. It was directed by Ridley Scott. So I was working the day that they had rented it out, and I was able to. So I was sitting at a table during lunch, and who sits around me was Ridley Scott and his crew. They were just talking about the next shot they wanted to do. And the only thing I got to ask about was, how do you decide what to ever make? What do you decide to do? And his thing was, what he said to me was, don't worry what anyone else is going to think. Make it your way, and don't even bother figuring it out if anyone's going to give a shit. Just make it the way you want to make it. And it's something that, it was a really quick conversation. And it was, kind of over right after that. And it was just something I value very much and something I think about often whenever I'm making stuff with AI, is because where I intend for it to go is all up to me. And it's something I think you should always figure out with your creativity, is wherever you want to go with it, it's up to you. That's why you self-finance. You want to go further into the studio system. You want to be in whatever creativity level you're comfortable with. Just be happy in how you make it and what you make. That's the most valuable thing you could have. It will be difficult, but I really do want people to enter this industry knowing how powerful it could be, but how painful it could be at the same time, and just be kind to each other, But yeah, Michael, did you want to kind of end out, or you want to sit around for a little bit and we can have some people up?
I'm good with either one. If people want to come and hang out and talk about the program, that's cool. Maybe even just kind of covering topical events in the scene is cool too. But I'm also fine with cutting it. I mean, we've been here an hour and a half. We hit everything that we wanted to, design to. And if people want to hang out and talk, grab a mic. If you're working on something, you want to promote it, feel free. You're welcome to do that. Or if you discovered a cool new tool, let us know about that. I am rounding the corner on a number of projects as well and trying to get stuff out the door. So, whatever anybody, if there's conversation, that's cool. If you want to wrap up, 15 minutes isn't going to break me. I'll grab something to eat because I got another call in 17 minutes. So,
just putting it out there. Anyone who wants to come up, kind of grab a mic. I'm that's the thing. The only thing I'm working on is trying to get this taxi thing out the door. And I just figured out today on how to add a VHS effect to it that changed my whole feeling about it. So, that's the thing about trying to create in this. It's like just whatever really attracts you, go for it. But yeah, if no one wants to come up, I think we'll just start. You want to do some housekeeping and then we'll shut her down?
Yeah, real basic, keep your eyes peeled. In the next hour, I would say I'll put out a post for links to the previous podcast. I have increased my podcast release schedule to 2 a week, because not every week, but plenty of weeks, because I just have so much stuff to put out there and doing a lot, and I want people to find it and hear it. As always, if we don't have you in the Discord server, there is a link up above, and you can join and hang out and talk tools and share your work and all the rest. And we'd be happy to have you come in there and share and ask questions if necessary, whatever the case might be.
Hell yeah. So we, the Film3, want you to have a really kick-ass Thursday and have a great weekend. We're trying these things out. The next one that we're going to have next month, I'm really excited about, so much so that I almost blew through all these notes beforehand, just saying that I want the thing we're going to be doing next, which is more on, we'll announce it. It's going deeper into the production level of pre-production level of stuff. And I'm really excited about it, especially building a screenwriting tool and all these other things that I've been kind of fucking doing in my crazy, insane life. But that's why I hope people are getting some value out of this. Next week, it'll be, less something about, it won't be a workshop. We'll just kind of be figuring out a new subject matter to go for. So, but thank everyone for coming, hanging out, listening to this, these methods and these madness things that, where our industry is and how to get into it. And much love. Have a good day, everyone.